In recent months, global tensions have clearly intensified. Conflicts in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, and the increasingly strained relations between the United States, Russia, and China are shaping the image of an unstable world. For many, these are simply political or military events, part of a familiar cycle in history. But there is another perspective, one that is far older. The Bible contains descriptions of times marked by widespread conflict, instability, and fear. Texts written thousands of years ago that, for some, seem surprisingly close to what we are witnessing today. The question is not whether the world has faced moments like this before. The question is whether what we are seeing now is just history repeating itself, or the beginning of something different.
If you want the truth, subscribe, like, and comment.
The idea that the world could at some point move toward a global conflict is not new. In fact, this possibility has been discussed, analyzed, and feared throughout history. What makes this topic different, however, is that it does not appear only in modern analysis or geopolitical theories, but also in ancient texts written thousands of years ago. In the Bible, there are multiple passages that describe a time when the world is not defined by peace or stability, but by constant tension between nations. It is not a single clearly defined war with a beginning and an end, but rather a general state of conflict that seems to expand and repeat itself. One of the most well-known expressions refers to wars and rumors of wars. At first glance, it may seem simple, but when examined more closely, it suggests something far more complex than an isolated event. It does not only refer to wars themselves, but also to how people perceive them. A constant awareness that conflict could begin at any moment. A tension that never fully disappears, but shifts from one region to another. This idea describes a world where instability becomes constant. A world where conflict is no longer seen as something exceptional, but as something normal. And this is where it becomes especially interesting. These descriptions do not provide specific details. They do not mention countries, technologies, or timelines. And yet the overall picture they create is surprisingly clear. A fragmented world where alliances shift rapidly, where balance is fragile, and where even small events can have large consequences. A world where conflicts are no longer isolated but interconnected, where what happens in one region can quickly influence the rest of the world. Throughout history, every generation has at some point believed it was living in such a time. During major wars, during nuclear crises, during periods of global instability, people have had the same feeling, that the world was approaching a critical point. But there is a subtle difference that is becoming harder to ignore. For the first time in history, all of these elements seem to exist at the same time. Conflicts in multiple regions, rising tensions between major powers, technologies capable of global destruction, and a level of interconnectedness that allows decisions to have immediate global impact. From this perspective, the question is no longer whether the world has faced similar moments before, because it clearly has. The real question is whether what we are seeing today is just another stage in that pattern, or the moment when that pattern reaches a turning point. If these passages do not describe a specific event, then what are they actually trying to convey? To understand this better, they need to be seen in the context in which they were written. Biblical texts were not created as political analysis or precise predictions of the future, but as symbolic descriptions of periods of profound change. Because of this, many of these references are not meant to be taken literally, but rather understood as patterns that repeat over time. When the idea of conflict between nations appears, it is not only about war in the traditional sense, but about a broader state of tension that affects the entire world. An imbalance that does not remain isolated, but expands and influences everything around it. In some interpretations, these periods are described as moments when the existing order begins to break down. Alliances become unstable, leaders make unpredictable decisions, and societies begin to live in a constant state of uncertainty. It is not necessarily an immediate collapse, but rather a gradual process in which things slowly move out of control. Another important aspect is the idea that people do not fully realize what is happening while it unfolds. Life continues to appear normal, even as the signs become more visible. This combination of normality and tension is one of the most compelling elements, because it suggests that major shifts do not always arrive as sudden shocks, but as subtle processes that only become clear when it is already too late to stop them. Throughout history, these passages have been interpreted in different ways. Some see them as symbolic warnings, others as real predictions about the future. But regardless of interpretation, one element remains consistent. They describe a world at a point of maximum tension, where the direction of events becomes increasingly uncertain. And when we look closely at how this type of period is described, one question naturally emerges. If these texts do not provide specific details, but still outline a clear pattern, is it possible that they were never meant to describe a single moment in the past or the future, but a type of reality that can appear at any time? A reality where balance becomes fragile, and the world begins to move toward a point of change. If we look at things only on the surface, today's world does not seem very different from other tense periods in history. There have been conflicts before, rivalries between major powers, and moments when people believed the situation was slipping out of control. But when we look more closely at the current context, a few differences begin to stand out. Differences that have never existed together in this combination. First, we are no longer dealing with a single isolated conflict. Today there are multiple active zones of tension at the same time, each with the potential to draw in other countries. The war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict. It indirectly involves some of the most powerful nations in the world. The situation in the Middle East has been unstable for years, but recent developments show how quickly tensions can escalate, where even a minor incident could trigger a wider reaction. At the same time, relations between the United States and China are becoming increasingly strained, particularly in economic and military terms. This is not an open war, but it is a constant competition that affects the global balance. The issue is not only the existence of these conflicts, but the fact that they are interconnected. A decision made in one part of the world can have immediate consequences somewhere else. This level of interconnectedness has never existed before. In the past, conflicts were more isolated, and their global impact was limited by distance and slower communication. Today, information moves instantly, alliances are complex, and reactions can be rapid and unpredictable. Another key factor is technology. For the first time in history, there are weapons capable of causing global-scale destruction in a very short amount of time. We are no longer talking only about conventional wars, but about the real possibility of affecting the entire planet. This completely changes how conflict must be understood, because it is no longer just about who wins or loses, but about how far a situation can escalate before it becomes irreversible. At the same time, there is another dimension that is less visible but just as important. Human perception. Even though information about conflicts is everywhere, many people continue to live their lives as if nothing fundamentally is changing. There is a certain normalization of global tension, as if it has simply become part of everyday life. This combination of real risk and reduced perception of that risk creates a unique situation. Because history shows that major shifts do not always happen when people are prepared, but when they believe things are still under control. When all of these elements are considered together, the picture begins to look different from the past. Not necessarily more dramatic, but more complex and harder to manage. And this is where the key question emerges. If in the past conflicts could be contained or controlled, what happens in a world where everything is connected, fast, and unpredictable? Is it possible that the real difference is not the intensity of conflicts, but the fact that, for the first time, the conditions exist for them to merge into a single global event? When all of these elements are considered together, the picture that begins to form is not a simple one. It is not just about individual conflicts or isolated tensions, but about a system that is becoming increasingly unstable. Throughout history, the idea of Armageddon has been interpreted in many different ways. For some, it is a place. For others, it is a final war. But there is another perspective, not as a location or a clearly defined event, but as a moment, a point where balance can no longer be maintained, a point where decisions cannot be reversed and consequences can no longer be controlled. In this sense, Armageddon may not describe a specific war, but the moment when multiple conflicts, tensions, and decisions begin to intersect. A moment where everything that once seemed separate starts to connect. And perhaps this is what makes the idea so difficult to fully understand. Because it is not necessarily a sudden explosion or a clearly visible event. It is rather a process. A process in which things build up over time, become increasingly tense, and eventually pass a certain threshold. Very often, moments like this are not recognized while they are happening. They only become clear later when people look back and realize that everything has changed. This idea appears repeatedly in interpretations of these texts. Not as an exact prediction but as a description of a turning point. And when we look at the world today, it is not necessarily about claiming that this moment has already begun. But it is also difficult to ignore the possibility that many of these conditions described so long ago are beginning to appear at the same time. Perhaps this is not about a single event that starts on a specific day. Perhaps there is no exact moment when everything changes. Perhaps the change does not come from one direction, but from the accumulation of multiple factors that, together, become impossible to control. And if that perspective is correct, then the question is no longer whether such a moment will exist, but whether, when it does, we will truly recognize what is happening, or if it will feel like just another ordinary day in a world that has already become used to tension.